I just want to introduce briefly our wonderful guest, Maher Arar. He is a telecommunications engineer and a passionate advocate of human rights, and I'm very grateful for his contribution to Omar Khadr, O Canada, which is a wonderful essay. He recently founded PRISM, which is a great magazine, online magazine, and you can find it at www.prismmagazine.com. It's an online not-for-profit magazine that focuses on national security-related issues. Maher Arar was a victim of extraordinary rendition in 2002. He was detained in the United States and deported to Syria, where he was imprisoned and tortured for over a year. In January 2007, a lengthy Canadian Commission of Inquiry cleared him of any links to terrorism. The Government of Canada offered an official apology and awarded compensation for the terrible ordeal he and his family suffered. The Syrian government has declared that Arar is completely innocent. In spite of this, the US government did not exonerate him, and he and his family remain on a watch list. Time magazine chose Maher as the 2004 Canadian Newsmaker of the Year, and 3 years later named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. The Globe and Mail called him the nation builder in 2006. And Maher continues to be an advocate of very active and engaged human rights voice in periodicals like the Globe and Mail, The Guardian, and Huffington Post, and he writes about issues of national and human security. And I should say that this is the 5th book launch I've organized. I had one in Ottawa, in Toronto, in Edmonton, where I live, and also at the Learned's, the Congress at Wilfrid Laurier University. And every event has its own character. This is very much a legal event, because many of the legal scholars, for some reason or another, live in Vancouver. In Toronto, there were a lot of literary people. In Vancouver, there were human rights activists and people who were very engaged in those issues. And at the Learned's, the Congress, I presented at the Muslim Studies, Religious Studies Association, which was a very, very interesting event with their own character. The only time that we had in Toronto, we had bomb threats and huge protests. And I think one of the reasons we need to engage in this issue is that it is actually allowing for the dissemination of Islamophobia. It's allowing for deep racist divisions, I think, to emerge. And it's also enabling extremists to feel they're authorized to speak and to act. Just recently, a group of people protested in Scarborough outside of Omar Khadr's family's home. They've lived there for many years, and they are living peaceful lives. They demonstrated there, and they actually brought along a motorcycle gang to scare them. So this is really vigilante, appalling behavior, and I think we all need to be very conscious that many of us live very comfortable lives, and others are suffering a good deal because of these issues. I was just up at Fort McMurray, Fort Mackay doing some work, and when I got on the airplane, the only person in a plane load of about 40 or 50 people who was asked to have an extra search was me and another young woman who looked Arab or Muslim. And I think there's a good deal of pressure put on people who work on these issues, and it's important for it to be a collective voice, not just isolated individuals. So I urge you all to join in the struggle. So I'll just begin now with Maher.
Oh, great. Good evening, everyone. My part is going to be very brief. I'm on the east coast of Canada, so there's 3-hour difference. So in a nutshell, I just want to briefly focus on the human side of things. I won't go into technical details, but I'll just be establishing very simple facts about the case of Omar Khadr from the US point of view and from Canadian point of view, and share with you some of what some prominent Canadians said about his story. We have to ask the question why and how Omar Khadr was captured, and this is a basic question. that get lost in the when we discuss political issues or technical details. So Omar Khadr was captured in Afghanistan, not obviously Manhattan, trying to blow up a civilian or government installation. We all know his story by now. He's a Canadian citizen who was captured on a battlefield in Afghanistan, which was illegally invaded by the US Army. He was only 15 years old at that time. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed, when his story emerged in the media early on, about 7-8 years ago, we could only see his photo as a child. And I don't know if you noticed, over time, this photo disappeared from the media. And we started seeing Omar Khadr, the man with a beard. And this obviously there's a reason behind that. And people over time, as a result of that, forgot that Omar Khadr was indeed captured when he was only 15 years old. So I want to emphasize this point. He is pretty much the perfect example of a child soldier that our government, unfortunately, does not want to admit. While as a government and as people, we try to help child soldiers in Africa, we don't deny the same exact right to one of our own. And we know obviously why the Canadian government, whether it's the present one or the previous one, have resisted labeling Omar as a child soldier, because the minute he's labeled a child soldier have, by international, have rights. Now, let me speak a little bit about I myself believe the Canadian government shares a big responsibility, but also we shouldn't forget the sham treatment that he has received since he was captured. We all know that the Department of Justice in the US charged him with, or basically the military charged him with a never heard of type of charge, which is called murder in violation of the laws of war. So what I say is, if the alleged crime was done in Afghan soil, why did not the US officials put Khadr or Omar on trial in Afghanistan? Why did they wait for almost 7 years to send him to a kangaroo court? Whoever has read the story in detail perfectly knows that there's contradictory evidence whether Omar is in fact the one who threw the grenade at the medic, that basically killed the medic. So there's this evidence is contested, has been contested in fact. So it's not, when we speak about facts, we have to be careful what facts are. So there's no, so in a nutshell, if Omar was tried in a civilian court, in my opinion, he would have been found not guilty, just because the quality of the evidence that was presented was either obtained under torture or under circumstances that make it, or at least throw some doubt into the evidence. So this is a very important point to make. And as Janice mentioned, I myself find it very, very dishonest for many, on behalf of many journalists, for them to describe him in absolute terms as a convicted war criminal, knowing that he was, put to the bricks, to say the least, a sham trial. Now, however, many pieces of evidence point to all kinds of abuses. When I say evidence, the established evidence, that Omar went throughout his detention through torture and abuse and mistreatment, like sleep deprivation, what the Guantanamo guards call the frequent flyer program. I don't know if you've heard this label before, but that's how they describe sleep deprivation In fact, before the CSIS agents went down to Guantanamo to interview him, he was in fact put on the sleep deprivation program for at least 2 weeks before the interview. Of course, we heard other piece of evidence where he was, threatened with rape, basically. So what I'm saying is, aren't these abuses enough to redeem his sin between quotes? Aren't 7 years spent between or now 9 years spent between the notorious Bagram and Guantanamo prisons enough? We all know in Canadian justice system, a year spent in detention center, in any detention center, which in my opinion is considered a 5-star hotel compared to the prison in Guantanamo, is counted as 2. How much should judges count each year that he spent at Guantanamo? So those are basic questions that in my activists have to focus on, because every average citizen understands those. Sometimes Omar's story gets lost into political details or technical details, but if you mention those facts to any decent human being, they will certainly to great injustice happening here. I want to mention 2 things or 2 quotes from 2 prominent lawyers. One is a human rights lawyer by the name of Paul Champ. If you know Paul Champ, he's a human rights lawyer based in Ottawa. And I liked what he said recently on a Prism article when he was interviewed. Basically said, I'm quoting here, "I think it is a real sad day for Canadian politics when human rights are turned into a popularity contest. And someone who was abused as a child is exploited political gain." Unfortunately, that's exactly what's happening with Omar. Instead of looking at him as a human being who deserves justice and who deserves to be repatriated to Canada, he's being used as a political. He's being looked at as a political loss or gain by our. Obviously, the actions or inactions of Prime Minister Harper and as Minister of Public Safety, Vic Taves, point to the fact without any doubt that they're very, very concerned about their core constituency and what kind of reaction they will get from them if they are just back to Canada. So that's pretty much right why the government has stonewalled the entire process. Now for Mr. Taves to come and say, well, we need the videotapes to make sure that Omar is a gentleman, basically. I think it's all excuses. Now the government have the tapes, they've looked at them. God knows what the next excuse will be. So it's just a delay tactic, and there's no more to it. In fact, so another but that I found quite powerful, I would like to share with you, is from his former lawyer. So the other one is, and I'm quoting here, Mr. Edney Said, and I found it powerful. He's saying here, it's sad because it is not just about Harper and the government. He's saying it is also about you and me and who we are as Canadians. What does being a Canadian stand for? Omar's story is about many things, but it's also about who are we as people. I think that's very much summarizes what the whole thing is all about. And let me say this last thing. I've often given this analogy to people I speak to about Omar's case. Regardless of what people say about our Prime Minister's ideology and all of those things, what I say basically, and regardless whether Omar is guilty or innocent, or whether he shares the same religion as Mr. Harper or not, or ideology, I say, as a Prime Minister, someone who's a Prime Minister should, in my opinion, treat the citizenry as his kids, and he can't just favor one kid over the other, even if one kid is kind of, between quote, rebellious. Let's put it that way. I mean, otherwise, what would we call a parent who favors one kid over the other? That's bad parenting. So I think the Prime Minister should seriously rethink his strategy. I think it is, if he believes he's going to satisfy a tiny percentage of the population at the expense of losing I think it's a dangerous game to play here, and I seriously think he should reconsider his strategy vis-a-vis repatriation of Omar. And that's it for me.
And thank you for being here. There's an awful lot that I could say about Omar Khadr, so I'm going to say some things very, very quickly. First of all, Omar Khadr has never been convicted of a legitimate offense. He's never even had the opportunity of being brought before a properly constituted court to determine his rights or any charges against him. He's been tortured for over 10 years, first in Bagram, then in Guantanamo Bay Prison. The Canadian government has been complicit in the violation of virtually all of his rights protected by international law and Canadian law, including rights to liberty, habeas corpus, to be properly informed of charges, to be represented by and have privileged communications with legal counsel, to have charges and rights determined by an independent and impartial tribunal, to equality before the law and to the equal protection of the law, to a trial within a reasonable time, to freedom from torture, from arbitrary arrest and detention, freedom from prosecution for ex post facto or otherwise illegitimate offenses, and lastly, the right of access to necessaries, proper food, education, privacy, control over one's immediate environment and living space, access to the company of other human beings, contact with friends and family. No court in the US or Canada has found Khadr's treatment at Bagram or Guantanamo Bay Prison to be legal or otherwise justifiable. Canadian courts, the Supreme Court, the Federal Court, and the Federal Court of Appeal have all ruled that the treatment of Omar Khadr in Guantanamo Bay violates the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the UN Convention Against Torture, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Geneva Conventions. In 2008, the Canadian Parliamentary Committee struck to consider the Omar Khadr case after hearing over 70 witnesses recommended, and I quote here, that the Government of Canada demand Khadr's release from US custody at Guantanamo Bay to the custody of Canadian law enforcement officials as soon as practical, close quote. On June 9th, the Canadian Senate adopted this resolution by a majority vote. On March 29th, 2008, the Canadian House of Commons did the same thing. In 2009, the Federal Court and the Federal Court of Appeal ordered Prime Minister Stephen Harper, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the commissioners of both the RCMP and CSIS to address these grave violations by promptly requesting Omar Khadr's release from US custody and his repatriation to Canada. The Harper executive again refused. In May 2012, the UN Committee Against Torture, in response to a report filed jointly by two organizations, Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada and the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, determined that Canada's treatment of Omar Canada did violate Canada's obligations under the Convention Against Torture, and recommended to Canada, quote, to promptly approve Omar Khadr's transfer application and ensure that he receives appropriate redress for human rights violations that the Canadian Supreme Court has ruled he experienced." Close quote. Now, backing up a little bit, on October the 13th of 2010, Omar Khadr agreed to plead guilty to the trumped-up charges in return for an agreement by the U.S. to limit his period of additional incarceration to 8 years, and the further agreement to allow Khadr to be repatriated back to Canada after serving one of those 8 years. Now, at that time, then Foreign Minister Lawrence Cannon said, and I quote, "We will implement the agreement that was reached between Mr. Khadr and the government of the United States." Close quote. Khadr's lawyers say that Canada's agreement, that agreement as expressed by Foreign Minister Cannon, would not have pled guilty without that agreement. Now, on April 12, 2012, the U.S. approved Khadr's transfer to Canada, and Canada is still refusing to allow or to approve his transfer. While the current Minister of Public Safety, Vic Taves, agrees that Mr. Khadr is entitled to come back to Canada eventually, by virtue of the fact that he's a Canadian citizen, Mr. Taves says, quote, "The issue of when does he come back to Canada, that's a determination I have to make, and I haven't made any decision in that respect yet." Close quote. Mr. Taves claims to be considering whether or not he will use his newly acquired discretion under the International Transfer of Offenders Act to refuse Khadr's repatriation to Canada. Now, if I could just give you some background information, Canada is a signatory to 13 bilateral treaties and 3 multilateral conventions on the transfer of offenders that have been convicted and sentenced overseas, and those agreements include the cooperation of over 60 nations. Between 1978 and 2009, over 1,500 Canadians were transferred back to Canada to serve their prison sentences in accordance with the purpose of that Transfer Act. That purpose being to promote justice and the rehabilitation and reintegration of Canadian offenders convicted abroad back into Canadian society. Transfer requests had been regularly accepted and permitted until 2006, when the Harper government started refusing to allow the transfer of a significant number of offenders. And since the plea agreement was entered into in October of 2010, the Harper's government, the Conservatives actually, all by themselves, because the Liberals and the NDP and the Bloc Québécois did not agree, have forced the amendment of the Transfer Act. Part of the hotly contested omnibus Bill C-38 was Bill C-5 to amend the International Transfer of Offenders Act to allow Minister Taves and his successors as public safety ministers to arbitrarily refuse the transfer of prisoners under the newly introduced rubric to that particular act of public safety. The amendments to the Transfer Act essentially allow, in the Khadr case, the use of the law to break the law. Khadr's Canadian lawyers have, of course, now filed yet another. All the lawyers in Canada that have been acting Mr. Khadr all these years have all been acting free. So Khadr's been denied both by the Canadian government and the U.S. government his internationally protected right to legal aid when having a lawyer is absolutely necessary. In any event, they filed an application in federal court asking for an order compelling Minister Taves to approve Khadr's transfer to Canada. They're pleading to the court, says a number of shocking things that I hope shock us. They say the minister has breached the principles of natural justice and deprived the applicant of procedural fairness. The minister's delay in rendering the decision is, they say, an abuse of process. In April 2002, the CBC conducted an online poll. The CBC is one of those media outlets that continues, every time they mention Mr. Khadr, to refer to him as a person convicted of murder, as a convicted war criminal, which is wrong, of course. They know all that. Anyway, they ran an online poll in April of 2001 with the question, quote, "Should Omar Khadr be allowed to return to Canada?" keeping mum, of course, of all the court orders, the experts, the decisions of the whole government of Canada, the Parliament and the Senate. And a whopping 43% of the people answered the poll by saying no. And so I'm very happy to have you here tonight, because now it's up to me and up to you to ensure that Omar Khadr's return to Canada just as justice and decency allow. Please write to Minister Taves, write to your Member of Parliament, speak to your neighbours. On the table over there, there's a bunch of copies of articles and reports that have been prepared by Lawyers' Rights Watch and Lawyers Against the War over the years, and a sign-up sheet if you want copies of all or any of that material, or want to be involved in any new initiatives to try and have Mr. Khadr repatriated to Canada. Thank you very much.